Now, in the last couple of lessons, we looked at how to thicken up the texture of your phrases using double stops, either third intervals, you know, or sixth intervals. Now, when you combine a third interval and a sixth interval, you actually create a three-note chord by putting all those notes together. The result is it's just a short hop from playing two notes at a time to playing three notes at a time. And in effect, then you're soloing with chords. That might seem like, you know, kind of a drastic concept. And, you know, if you think of jazz chord melody, it can get pretty deep. But we're going to do it blues style. And the way the guys used to do it, you know, in acoustic blues was when they had to keep time for themselves, they'd play a little pattern on the low strings. I'm going to show you how to do this later, by the way. And you know, that sound, which I'm sure you've heard, that's sort of Robert Johnson style chord melody. Now, what makes it a chord melody is that, you could say on the one hand, every chord has a melodic component to it, because whenever you voice a chord, you're choosing the notes of the chord based on a certain arrangement, and one of the important factors is what note's on top. And when we play horn section voicings and all that stuff, we're paying attention to the top note and saying, how does this chord connect to that chord via the melody? So we're going to just take that idea a step further and look at our melodies from the top down. This is top-down thinking, you might call it. So the first step along the way is to develop a set of chords that we can move around easily. And these three-note chords are not hard to finger. In the key of A, if I start at the low end of the neck and say, where are my A7 chords? Thinking from the top down, I've got A7 with the 7th on top. That's about as close as I can get without using open strings for the moment. Next up, I would have A with the root on top. So what I'm doing here is using the arpeggio. And I'm going to harmonize each note of the arpeggio, each chord tone, with a three-note chord. So there's the 7th harmonized with just a regular A chord. We know that chord already. There's the root harmonized with an A chord, just top part of that triad there. Here's the 3rd harmonized with another 7th chord that we've used quite a bit. And then here's the 5th. And I'm harmonizing it with that chord that I introduced as part of the Chicago style. It's a voicing, and it's not exclusive to Chicago, but the guitar players in Chicago seem to favor that chord a lot. So A7 with the 5th on top. So if I play them together, I've got now, those are pretty distinct chords, and that doesn't sound like much of a melody. It's pretty technical. But the way that players put those chords together is basically, it's very intuitive. You just use half steps. If I want to get from here to there, I go, and that's the sound that we heard in the turnarounds, the classic turnarounds. Now we're filling in the middle note. Or I could be down here. Here's another slightly different approach on the same idea. Just reach up and add another note to the top of the chord. If I want to keep going. So in effect, I can play melodies all over the place, but I'm really just using 4 shapes and manipulating those shapes by moving them up and down in half steps. So the basic idea is not that complicated. You got to get your fingers wrapped around it and be able to move it consistently without getting lost. But once you're able to do that on the A chord, then exactly the same concept would apply to the 4 chord and the 5 chord. So In the key of A, the 4 chord is D. And I say, what's the lowest voicing of D that I can find? Let's see, D. Here's my D arpeggio. Let's see, D, that's on the 2nd string. I don't want that. How about, there we go. On the 1st string, D7. Now, the voicings are not going to change whether it's A or D or the 5 chord E. Same exact voicings, just in different positions. So I know that when I played A with the 3rd on top, the next voicing up was A with the 5th on top. Well, the same thing will apply. D, 3rd on top, D with the 5th on top. I can finger it like this. I'm stretching or relax it a little bit like that. What's the next voicing up? It would be the 7th on top. And what's after that? The root. So there's D, 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 D. So from A, I look for my connections, just as I do with melodies. Right? Going from A to D melodically, I say, well, the 3rd of A, down a half step, there's the 7th of D. Well, the same thing applies with chords. The 3rd of A is on top of that chord. Here comes D, the 7th. Nice little connection. So the melody is still a melody. It's just that I'm harmonizing the melody as I'm moving it around. The same thing would apply in just about any spot there. Here's A with the root on top. There's D with the 5th on top. It's the same note. Here's A with the 7th on top. And right next door is D with the 3rd on top. Now, thinking about the numbers can drive you crazy, but you learn the shapes, and you just say that 1 chord goes to that 4 chord. Okay, that's a move that I can kind of absorb and put to work. Now, the last part of the puzzle here would be the 5 chord. I'm in the key of A. My 5 chord is E. So I think, what are the notes in an E7 chord? I've got root 3rd, da, da, da. Well, I could start down here with E in open position, but if I want to stay away from the open strings for the moment, next one up would be E7 with the 3rd on top, and then the shapes will go in the same exact order every time. 5th on top, 7th on top, and root on top. So when I go from A to E, there's A, there's E, there's A, there's D. Here's A, here's D, here's A, here's E. Right. Here's A, here's D, here's A, here's E. A, D, A, E. It's kind of miraculous in a way, but each of the chord changes is within a half step of the other. If you look at the melodies, they're all like right there together. So the art of it is to find those connections on the fly. And as is true of every other element of style that we develop here, you start with a lot of thinking, a lot of practicing, memorization. You memorize phrases. You get your fingers to cooperate so you can play in tempo. And as you build up a vocabulary, then at a certain point you're able to think spontaneously, and you can kind of hear the next chord coming and make decisions more on the fly. But at the beginning, it's planning, careful execution, memorization, get the muscles to cooperate, and everything else follows from that. So I'm going to give you an example of a 12-bar blues in A using chords, soloing with chords. Now, to actually play an entire 12-bar solo with chords, in the electric guitar realm, you don't hear it that often, these days especially. This is a single note world that we live in. But think of the chords as being an extra texture that you can use. So, if you're like the double stops, you're playing single notes all the time, that becomes your main go-to sound. And to mix it up a little bit, you just say, well, I'm going to add another note to that, make it a double stop. I'll add 2 notes to that, make it a chord. And it gives you a different way to kind of launch a chorus of a solo, and it's a little ear catching. And from that, you can then switch back again, like So there I use my chords as my intro, and it's such a blues sound, you know, it's such a classic blues sound that type of phrasing just brings you right back to the delta. And then I'm playing my single note licks that I would normally play. And I'll show you all these ideas in various forms as we go through the curriculum here. But for today, let's just take the chords and isolate them and really play melodically using chords over a 12-bar shuffle in A. And I'll show you how to make these changes. Okay, here we go. Now the idea there that I played was pretty much what I've been talking about and just put together in tempo. So A7, down a half step. Now what's going on there? Well, that's what you might think of it as an embellishment. It just adds a little color to it. Technically what's going on there, believe it or not, I'm playing a diminished chord. This goes back, remember, to the ragtime sound of the, it was a pop style of music that preceded the blues, and you had lots of diminished chords were used in ragtime harmony as kind of passing chords. They're the glue that ties the other chord changes together. So there's an example of that. A7 to a, oh, what would you call that? A diminished, actually. And then I go down in half steps. And then I switched to another A7 chord. I played that A7 with the root up on top with my little finger, created that melody there. And then there was D7 right there. Can't miss it. Up in half steps. Now I did a little move there where I didn't move the whole chord. I just moved the lowest note. Just a variation on the idea, something that I've heard and liked and borrowed, stole, you know. So, and then I kind of stripped it down a little bit, right? So instead of playing the full chord, I played the sixth interval that's on the outside of the chord, right? A little trill there, just that rapid hammer-on pull-off. And then, that's real down-home stuff there. E7 with the alternating between the 7th and the root. And then I went to a more of a Chicago style. Right? Now, I'm still playing chords. I'm thinking chords. I wasn't playing the full 3-note voicing, but I was thinking going from the 7th to the 6th to the 5th. And then a turnaround. A million ways you can do this stuff. It's a matter of how you hear it. So what I've got in the back of my mind as I'm playing that is players that I've listened to. Jimmy Rogers, you know, who is Muddy Waters guitar player, but also a recording artist in his own right, made a lot of great records. And he electrified that down-home sound and used those chords in such a beautiful way. So you hear it in the acoustic guys for sure, but the electric guitar players of that early generation of city blues also took that same technique and moved it forward. So you can listen to those recordings. I've given you some recommendations to go check out and see how it's used in context. But you know, as with everything else, to really master the idea, you got to move it around to different keys and see where those chord tones are. And after a while, just like the third intervals and the sixth intervals, you start to see the shapes as just a familiar pattern. And it's like, oh yeah, well if I'm playing this, then that's next door and that's the next one, and your hand snaps into position. Now, with your hands doing it and the motor memory instilled, that's when you can use your ear and start to be creative with it and make more spontaneous decisions. But take that example I showed you there and work on it and get it in tempo and send it to me. Let me hear what you're doing. I want to hear how you're using these chords so I can kind of listen and give you some feedback. All right, have fun with that one.